Alrighty. Looks like we're good to go. Hello. Hi. Huh. Hello. Oh, God. Why is this the hardest part, honestly? The lips, the teeth, the tip of the tongue. The lips, the teeth. Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Jillian Starts a Podcast. I'm Jillian, and I started a podcast. And the point of this series is to talk about the process of starting a podcast when you're a person that doesn't know how to do that. I started this series because I wanted to document the process of starting a podcast, and also just remind myself of how far I've come. And I kind of remember, I kind of want to remember all like the little bits, all the parts of starting a podcast that kind of kept me up at night, just as a kind of a progress report for myself, but also just to, just remind myself of how difficult of a process this was. And I don't know, maybe this might be inspiration for other people who want to start a podcast, and maybe they can watch this and kind of know the nitty gritty about getting into starting a podcast. So the last episode, I did like kind of a numbers breakdown of how many followers I've gained on Instagram and TikTok, and how many subscribers I have on YouTube and Spotify. I thought about doing that again for this episode, but I decided that I don't only want to focus on the numbers. I don't want to, I just don't want to track it. I just feel like the idea of every episode being like, okay, this is how many subscribers I have, that just like kind of takes away from the point, and also just feels very stressful. So I might do the numbers again in a couple of weeks from now, a couple episodes from now. But for now, I just kind of want to focus on everything it took to get to this point. So thank you for being here. So in today's episode, I am going to be talking about the very, very, very beginning of the podcast, when she was just an idea, how she popped into my head, how capitalism turned her into what she is today. Obviously, the Slightly Off Plan podcast is about 36-year-olds who haven't done all the conventional things that mid to late 30s people are supposed to do by now, which is get married, have kids, own a home, climb the corporate ladder, etc., etc. Shout out to all of you out there that are going through the same thing that I'm going through. You are not alone, and you are in good company. I decided to take off a couple of rings because it was click-clacking too much. I've learned a lot about sound since starting this podcast, the hard way. Anyway, so late last year, I was on the phone with my sister, Dr. Ellis, who's in her 40s, owns a home, she's married, and by all accounts has done everything kind of on time, like the way that you're supposed to do things. The way that you're supposed to do things. Fun little side note, my sister got married in her mid-30s, and we're 8 years apart. So when I was in like my late 20s, was when she got married in her mid-30s. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, my sister got married a little bit later than I would like to. Hopefully, like, that won't be an issue for me. Joke's on me. I'm past the age that she's gotten married. So if you're in your 20s looking at me like, oh gosh, I really hope I'm not like her. Kindly fuck you. But I get it. When you're in your 20s, you just have like no idea how life works. I get it. But still, fuck you. And I think it's important to say that around this time, I had left my job as a DevOps engineer, and I was kind of looking for the next thing that I was going to do. I was like, maybe I'll go back into teaching. Maybe I'll stay in tech. I'm not sure. For those of you that don't know me, I was a math teacher for 6 years. And then I was a software engineer / DevOps engineer for 4 years. And I had a particularly uninspiring and like kind of challenging week where I was just struggling with basic things. I was struggling with doing my laundry and like keeping my dishes cleaned and like keeping myself fed. And as someone with no dependence or any real responsibility, but ADHD mixed with a little anxiety and depression, I always just felt really behind, and like I couldn't stay on top of the basic things that I needed to do. And so I'm on the phone with my sister, and she was just kind of saying that she said something along the lines of like, oh, I feel like a hot mess. And I was like, oh, So that feeling never goes away. And she was like, no. And I was like, oh, cool, fun, awesome, great. And I remember thinking, if my sister, who on paper has her life together, if she feels that way, then, oh, it's not just me that feels overwhelmed all the time. And then that kind of led to, well, I can't imagine how people with kids feel or a partner to think of on top of what I'm feeling. So then I started thinking, okay, well, I'm 36. I'm not married. I don't have kids. I don't own a home. At the time, I didn't have a job. And I feel this way. I can't be the only one. So then I started thinking about like my friend group and my cousins. And, not all of us have all of the things. And actually, a good portion of my friends also are kind of in the same boat as I am. Either they don't have any of the things or they, have some bits. And I was like, oh, okay. So I'm not the only one. Maybe it would be fun to do like a Humans of New York kind of Instagram page where I interview my friends and, maybe connect with other 36-year-olds around the world. And then, I take a picture of them exactly like Humans of New York. This is how I thought about it. Take pictures of them, ask a couple of questions, like write a whole bio. And I was like, oh, that'd be so cute. I could make it into like a little Instagram page and really just like connect with other 36-year-olds going through the same thing. But also the idea that I had in my head was I wanted to make it global. Most of the people that I talk to on a day-to-day basis are either from the UK or the US, obviously with other people mixed around. But, what if someone in Japan that's 36 feels the same way? Or what if someone in Kenya that's 36 feels the same way? And I was like, oh, this could be a fun little project. And then capitalism. And I had just recently left my job. I was looking for a creative project to kind of really get into something a little bit bigger. And so I started brainstorming a little bit and I was like, oh, why not make this into a podcast? The funny thing about that is, truth be told, I'm actually not an avid podcast listener. I've definitely listened to some podcasts throughout the years. I think the first big one was Serial back in the day. I know I've definitely listened to the Michelle Obama podcast, and Trevor Noah has a podcast that I listen to sometimes. But I'm not like a, avid every day I'm listening to a podcast kind of person. I do think that was a little bit of a deficit trying to break into an industry that I don't know that well. But I have this thing where I think I can genuinely do most things at least decent if I like really try. So a combination of ADHD and being a Capricorn, there was no part of me that was like, no, I like that's not going to be hard at all. Like I was like, oh yeah, I'll just start a podcast. But you know what? I did it. Started the podcast. So there it is. Okay, so now I've decided that I'm doing a podcast, and there was a few things that I knew right away. I knew that I wanted it to be video and audio. Like I knew that I wanted to go on YouTube and Spotify. Those are the two mediums that I consume a lot. So that is just what made sense to me. I knew that I wanted to go big on marketing. I knew that I wanted to use like comedic skits as a way of marketing. I'm obsessed with marketing. I love good marketing. So I knew that was something that I was going to want to focus on. And then I started to think about what the podcast was going to look like. Is it just going to be me interviewing friends? Is it going to be me and a co-host? These were all things that I was trying to figure out in the beginning. So a little side note, around this time, I started really getting more into comedy and improv, and I wanted to start really doing collaborations with other people. So I held on to this idea in the beginning that I had to do this podcast with another person. And so I had the idea in my head. I had already been wanting to collaborate with friends a little bit more. And so I have a comedian friend who popped into my head, someone that I do improv with, and he fit the criteria. 36, single, doesn't own a home, blah, 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 everything, right? You guys know the checklist. And I remember at the time thinking, oh my God, I just had this amazing idea come into my head. And then the perfect, I've been wanting to collaborate. And then the perfect person who fits the criteria of the idea that I had in my head, it all came together. I remember being like, oh my God, like this is perfect. I cannot believe that everything just lined up so perfectly. So I'm freaking out and I immediately sent him a VM. I found the VM. Here it is. My guy, I got a project for us. And I just came up with this idea, and I think it would be the perfect project for both of us. That's not that high lift, like it's very low lift. And I think that it's a great concept. So yeah, I'm gonna kick it to you. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you want to like add to it, change it a bit, like, whatever, this, that, like your angle. Just like, yeah, let me know what you think. Anyway, so um we both just turned 36, so I think this is another great reason why this would be a great project for both of us to work on together. And I'm in my kind of place at 36. You're in your place at 36, and I'm not where I expected to be. I don't think you are either. And I was just thinking, like, what does 36 look like for everyone else? And it's gonna be so different, right? Like if I have a 36-year-old friend that's married with a house and two kids. And I have another 36-year-old friend who um, just got engaged, just bought a $2 million house, and, is getting married and is trying for a kid. And like, there's just so many different variations of like what 36 looks like. And I'm just choosing 36 because like we are 36. But I thought it would be really cool to kind of like do like a Humans of New York style type Instagram page, where we just interview a bunch of 36-year-olds. And definitely let's try to make it funny. I think like the difference between Humans of New York and all those pages and stuff is like a lot of them are more serious. I would like it to be, I mean, maybe serious and funny. Um, or whatever. I don't know. And yeah, and just like kind of, ask a few basic questions, have a conversation with them, that it lasts a couple minutes, make an Instagram page and post it. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I think people would be able to connect with that because we can explore, you know, like I think we can ask like we can interview a bunch of 36-year-olds, but then we can also like expand it to like, people older than 36, and like where were you at 36? Is that what you were expecting? Like how did that year change your life or whatever? Just like a bunch of questions that like could be really interesting. And then also on the flip side, asking, 20-year-olds, like what does 36 mean to you? What does, asking a 14-year-old, like asking a 5-year-old, like what does 36 mean to you? Like, I don't know. I think that would be a really interesting like social experiment to like kind of, yeah, just see what 36 looks like across the board, around the world. Like we could, I know I can interview people. I mean, yeah, both of us have people like outside of the UK and the US that we can like interview and whatever. I don't know. Anyway, tell me, tell me what you think, bro. We could even turn this into a podcast. All right, tell me what you think, man. I think this is a good one. Listening to that back is really cool because it's October now, and I I haven't listened to that BM since I sent it. So it's kind of cool to, wow. It's really cool to yeah, that's really cool. To hear that like kind of initial set of plans, and I hit a lot of it. And the message that I got back from him was basically like, yeah, dope idea. Sounds great. I'm in. And I was like, yes. So we're both getting really excited about this idea. We're sending VMs back and forth to each other. We met up and did like a brainstorm. We're telling other people about the podcast, and we even met up and a couple of times and recorded maybe 3 to 4 hours of just kind of like a test run just to see how it would feel. Because neither of us knew anything about starting a podcast or what it was like to be on a podcast or anything. So yeah, one of the first things that we did was just like kind of just see like, hey, how's this going to work? And we even decided on a name. It was going to be the 1987 podcast, which was also a contender for, what obviously became the Slightly Off Plan podcast. Again, just with just like Jillian starts a podcast about being 36 when I asked a bunch of my friends, which one they liked better. That one didn't do as well as Slightly Off Plan podcasts. I did like the name, though. I really like 1987. I've liked 1987 way before Taylor Swift came out with her 1989 album. I'm just going to say that right now. It is interesting, though. This is just a side note. It is interesting the feeling people get when they hear certain things, specifically in this case, 1987 podcast, because there were some people who loved it and like really liked the name. And there were some people who had different reactions to it. Like some people were like, oh, 1987, like 1989, like Taylor Swift. And some people were like 1987 podcast, like 1984, the book. And I was like, no. Anyway, I don't know. I thought that was interesting. It was a little market research on like, the emotional responses people have to things. Anyway. And so that excitement lasted for about 3 weeks before I learned a very hard lesson, which is just because things line up and feel like everything has fallen into place doesn't mean that it is necessarily the right fit. Am I talking about the podcast or my dating life? And after a few weeks, it became very clear that me and my friend, who I'm still friends with and have no hard feelings towards, but it became very clear that we weren't going to work well together and that I was going to move forward with the project without him. And that was really hard for me to accept at the time. I just remember feeling very scared because I had this idea of this podcast in my head for 3 weeks, and I really believed in the idea, and I really wanted to give the podcast the care that it needed. But from the time that I thought of the idea up until the time where we decided to part ways, I had only imagined this podcast with a co-host. And so the idea of doing it alone was like unfathomable to me. It was actually really scary because I just couldn't wrap my head around it, because the idea was always to have a co-host. And because he popped into my head so early on in the process of thinking of this podcast, the podcast was a podcast with me and a co-host. And towards the end, before we decided to officially part ways, I remember holding on for dear life. And I was ignoring like very clear red flags that we wouldn't work well together. And I remember thinking like, oh, this is just the growing pains. This is just a bump in the road. Like, we'll be fine. Like, we just need to get past this and we'll be fine. Am I talking about my dating life or this podcast? Honestly. And I remember thinking like, we have to do this together. Like I have to have a co-host. There's no way I'm going to have enough material to do this on my own. There's no way it's going to be good without a co-host. But guess what, Jillian from 2024? Fret not, because you did it. You're doing it. It's awesome. So once again, I just really want to appreciate how far I've come, because before recording this episode and finding that VM and kind of going through that whole thing that happened in January earlier this year, I actually forgot that there was a time where I had completely convinced myself that I wasn't going to do this project. I completely convinced myself that I couldn't do this on my own. And yeah, I almost didn't do it. But right now, at the time of this recording, I have 7 episodes out. I'm editing my 8th one. I have my 9th one and my 10th one set up, and I'm going to record those in the next couple of weeks. And I'm doing it. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, I'm just glad that I'm doing the thing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. If you watched this far, if you have any questions about starting a podcast, or if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok, and like and subscribe. I really need to come up with a goodbye. You know what? That'll come with time. Bye. Thank you for being here.